public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula.
Said it perfectly. All right, so it looks like Brian is popping in, and we have Cammie and Elizabeth join as well.
All right, welcome back, everybody, or welcome to, because I know that first meeting was confusing with the scheduling, but we're all reunited. All right, so we're just going over our mandatory statement, just reminding us to what our focus is, that we are looking to create a new funding formula. We are not focusing on the current BE funding formula. So if you want to go ahead to our agenda slide, that would be great.
And remember, top of the agenda is to vote for a vice chair.
That's right. So let's do that before I forget. All right. Do we have a formal process that we have to follow, Jamie, or can...
Nope. Anybody can vote anybody else. Anybody can volunteer. All we need is a name out there, and then we'll have to second it, and I'll say aye.
This is
Any
Samantha
volunteers?
Stevens. I nominate Daniel Warner as vice chair.
Oh, that's what you get, Mr. Warner, for abandoning us for Spain.
Do you have to be present to win? I think that might need to be.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
I think we'll make that a requirement. We won't nominate anyone who's not here tonight, I guess. Any volunteers? Okay, anyone gonna nominate anyone? All right, I guess I could close my eyes and point to point to my computer screen. I don't know, guys. What do you think?
Is it possible to get some guidance on what that means? Like,
Good question, Jamie.
does
Yep.
it come with the car? I don't know.
It's time for the car.
Just
Yeah,
kidding.
so in case Morgan has to step out, or if she happens to have something conflict with the schedule, basically what you're agreeing to is that you would run the meeting for that day. And so it's just, there isn't a lot of upfront work. Morgan can tell you, we kind of chat for 20-30 minutes ahead of time before our meeting. And then in the long run, she will be approving and signing off on formal recommendations. But as a vice chair, it really is kind of the stand-in just in case, you know, the world falls apart. So.
And Jamie really does make it easy. She's really easy to work with.
Well, I haven't heard that one in a long time.
I don't care to volunteer if anybody else feels like they would like it. I don't care to jump in.
Anyone second that? Thank you, Erin. All right, we have to vote officially on that, Jamie?
Yep, all in favor.
All in favor? Aye.
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 Super. All right, Hannah, 'tis you.
Thank you, Hannah.
So before Morgan gets in, congratulations to Hannah. We look forward to pulling you into the fold. I do want to share a couple of housekeeping things right off the bat. As meetings start to unfold, a couple different things you're going to need to know. One, where is the stuff that I need to look at? So remember, the Google Drive is linked in your calendar invite. The first link that you have in the notes section is to the parent folder that has every subcommittee and all of their meetings. Each meeting then populates with materials a few days ahead of time. The second link in the calendar invite is actually today's meeting. So it will be the meeting that you are getting ready to join. That's the second link. So that is in every calendar invite you have. I've already sent them all for the remainder of our 4 meetings that we have left. If by chance you have something sort of like Brianne had today and your hyperlink doesn't work, just give me a quick shout, send me an email, and I'll copy and paste it to you in an email. So easy peasy. Next thing, I have dropped that in the chat, by the way, if you want to go ahead and bookmark it. So I have had the question, like, can we go into other subcommittee folders? There's absolutely no reason you can't. You can, they're there. I'm not so sure, you know, the PowerPoint's no different. The agenda may have just different names on it, obviously, but other than that, until batches of feedback data start populating in Google Drives, there won't be anything for you to look at in meetings 1 and 2. But for 3, 4, and 5, if that, you know, you really are dying for some interesting reading material, it's there. It's not like it's closed at all. And there's no to not looking. So if you want to, have at it. If you don't want to, it's not your responsibility. Next thing that I've dropped in the chat is the web page, which is our funding formula web page. You're going to see every subcommittee listed. And if you click on your subcommittee, you will see the materials for the day, the agenda, and you're going to see the recording. So if you happen to miss a meeting, you are encouraged to watch that prior to the next meeting. Actually, it'd probably behoove you to look at it prior to even your next batch of feedback so that you can kind of get situated, what the team really thought about, discussed, and landed on, so that then you can get into that batch of feedback and data to prepare you for the next meeting. So that's where they are. All you have to do is click on it. The drop down will link you to a YouTube of the recording. So that's it for me for housekeeping. Just know that if you have questions, you're more than welcome to reach out. Morgan, me, either one, doesn't matter. Email us and let us know if you have questions. We're just really wanting to support you to be able to really dig in. You do not have any public feedback or a data batch today due to kind of the holidays. They are waiting to filter that in for all subcommittees right after the holidays. So when we come back for our meeting number 3. So today, as Morgan's getting ready to get into it, you won't have that, but remember, this is an opportunity to think about at your core, what do you know as the experts at the table here, what do you know must be in a funding formula, a new funding formula. So dig deep and you'll get there today, no doubt. It's been great discussion this week and last week as well. So Morgan, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to start taking some notes, and about 5 minutes before we wrap today, I'll read over any of my notes and any recommendations that you feel like I need to send up to the steering committee. All righty.
Of course. So the remainder of our time today will be mostly focusing on that discussion that Jamie's mentioned. So like she said, we don't have materials we have to review. It's going to be our ideas, and it's up to us to categorize it. So basically, what we're doing is creating a list of resources, and it may be smart just to I guess we kind of have to decide on a process. Do we just want to almost brainstorm the list of all the things that we would like to see in the funding and then start categorizing, or would we like to think of a specific category and then begin brainstorming? What do you think makes the most sense?
I would say probably just whatever we feel like needs to be there first, and then we can kind of put them, you know what I mean? That way it's more broad at first, and then we can start to narrow it down from there.
Good.
That's
So
just my opinion.
I think that's perfect. So why don't we start with our must-haves, and just a reminder, the must-haves they're required. So they're federally funded or required by state law, or for safety or something similar. So what are those must-haves that cross your mind right away when you think of the things that are already funded that we know we need to keep?
I one of the things that from going to the town hall and then just listening to what the teachers at my school have said, I think continuing funding for school social workers and school counselors. I know that that isn't, I'm sure that like that's not necessarily teaching, but I can't do my job without my school counselor and my school social worker. And so I also wanted to mention that looking at ratios and seeing if we could get schools in better ratio. I know in my county, we have one school counselor at every school, and we have some schools that have 600 kids. So I don't know how that person does their job, but that was one of the first things that I was really hoping to see get added on to, just because it helps every single population of kids. There's not a single kid that doesn't benefit from having school counselors helping.
So what I'm hearing Elizabeth say is that a must-have would be that our school counselors and social workers continue to be funded, and that also we look at increasing the funding for those two roles, and consider adjusting the ratio that is used to qualify the number of that are hired to support at the school level. I know a lot of the times when I think of must-haves, I think of special education and requirements for second language teachers, ESL teachers, or ELL teachers. Any insights or thoughts on that?
That's exactly what came to my mind too, Morgan. And in RTI, like everything that, you know, is a stepping stone to whether or not a child receives services. So the programs, the materials, the personnel, I mean, there's so many things under RTI special services and ESL.
Does anyone feel like any of those areas maybe need additional funding? And maybe some specific ideas about what that would look like at the school level?
One possible thing that doesn't come up often, but it does come up, would be possibly interpreters, either for ESL, also possibly an interpreter for the deaf, like a sign language teacher.
I think that did not even cross my mind. That is I think that's an incredible thing to put on our list. I think we have one interpreter for our entire district, and I have never seen someone work like he has run off his feet. That is an excellent point, Samantha.
I would also add, thinking about ESL, EL students, the needs of those students varying, depending on if it's a newcomer or a student who, looking at their data might need a higher level of support. If there was a way that could kind of be, I don't know if to say weighted, but, just kind of thinking about the needs of the student, because some needs of students are going to be greater at different times. And so kind of being mindful of that too.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the WEDIS is the screening we use, right? Statewide. It would be really interesting to see if somehow the degree of support that student needed could generate additional time with the teachers that student needs.
Yes, and I think you could even, in a sense, you could think about it that, if you had one person in that school that was supporting those students, that they could kind of weave between the needs of the students. This student may need more now, this student may need less later, and kind of going back and forth. But that's not always true if you happen to have maybe a higher significant or a more significant population of newcomers at a certain time. So the needs of a specific area or specific school may fluctuate, even though the numbers might not necessarily fluctuate, but the need might be greater at a certain time.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think I'd love to add on to that, because we've had that issue a lot in my district this year, and I think like continued training, I'm endorsed to teach English language learners. And at one point this year, they asked me if I wanted to give up my planning to teach 2 groups. And it's just like, I said no, not because I didn't want to help the kids, but just because you can't do both adequately. But I think the training, like we just finally got another teacher and now our numbers have gone up again. And so that person's pulled out and the director is coming and doing those classes. And so I definitely think considering the population, just like with social work and school counseling, different areas will need different support. But then also making sure that like if you do have people that are trained, that they have adequate time and like that they, I don't know, continue training. I also haven't been in college in 7 years and it's been a long time since I've done those classes and I haven't worked with a lot of ELL students because of the demographic where I teach. And for me to be all of a sudden their primary teacher, I just didn't feel like I was adequately prepared to provide those services either. And so I'll do it when I need to and it's that or nothing. But I think when we're looking at reworking the budget, that or nothing should hopefully be able to get cut out. And those kids should get support from highly trained. I think maybe pouring funding into the like dual endorsing teachers. I know at UT Knoxville, they've been doing a lot of that, but like getting teachers who are endorsed in that from the get-go. I know a lot of people who wish that they'd gotten that endorsement when they were in school rather than trying to figure out what to do on the back end.
So I'm hearing that one of the other things that we would, really like to take a closer look at is how we fund instructions for our students with a second language. We'd like to maybe look at more in depth of weighting that funding by student need and looking at how that could evolve as the student maybe needed less support or more support, especially newcomer students, because that is just such a difficult experience for a student. And I feel like that, those first few years can really make or break a student's experience within the school system. Elizabeth, I think you raised a great point about helping like training teachers. Many of us, I think, received some sort of instruction when we were in teachers college in students who speak another language. But I think once you're in the classroom, you really get the trial by fire and see how, it's one of those things that like until you're in it, it's really hard sometimes to wrap your head around. So that training, even on the job, would be excellent as well. And a great support for our students. It would pay dividends down the road. I'm trying to think anything else that would be federal or state law or safety. Does SROs would fall under that, right? We had discussed that last meeting as well, I think.
I was going to say SROs, and I was also going to mention school nursing as well. And I think that's again on a need-based thing, and I don't want to go so far as to say that some areas don't need it as much as others, but I think some areas have allocated those resources and whereas some have not, because I've worked in systems where they have an RN in every building and that's great. And there are some days in our building and we have 2,000 kids in our building. And there are some days that there's 3 of them here, plus there's actually 3 RNs that are actually teachers. So we have to jump in and help sometimes. But then I know there are some systems that they have 1 nurse that travels between 5 schools in a week. So the nurse is only there 1 day a week, and then they have to train teachers to do emergency meds and things like that. And so, I think that those resources could be better, better, maybe give more nurses to these schools so that they're not sharing nurses, just like we don't want them to necessarily share counselors and social workers and things like that. They need somebody in the building all the time for the safety and the health of the students. And I would also say that about SROs too. I think that the unfortunate reality is we're just in a time that's necessary. Unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm just looking back at my notes because in our chair meeting, we talked a little bit about weights because one of the things you noted was that like different schools or even different districts are going to require different numbers of supports in terms of nursing and SROs. And, like things like poverty and disabilities and English language learners, those are all tied to federal funding. And so if they're weighted, that the population can change. It has a big impact on the state budget because it's not fixed. And we talked a little bit on capping that weight per year because some states do it real time. So the budget fluctuates as the needs change. And then others use the previous school year to predict. So I think you make a great point that, these things can be different from district to district and year to year. So how that money ends up weighted that's a bit of a question mark.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I just feel like, I think right now you have to have a nurse per so many students, when I feel like, I don't know if maybe that wording can be changed, because, I think you've got to look at who your students are, and you know what I mean? Like if you're sharing a nurse between 4 elementary schools and that number adds up to 2,000 students or whatever it is, but at each one of those schools you have very, either sick kids or kids that have a lot of chronic conditions, and there's nobody there to take care of that. I don't know how the wording can be changed, and I don't know that's, maybe it's not the wording in the funding, but maybe we could put it in there somewhere. Just because I see what happens when, I've seen it because I have been a school nurse, so I've seen how that affects the kids and the teachers and the other faculty that are in the buildings that have to be pulled from their what they need to do to help with that.
Yeah, I wish I had it at my fingertips, like the PowerPoint we had from that meeting, because it kind of clarified a little bit of that kind of thinking that, they made it sound like there was a way to move some of these positions away from necessarily being like student ratios. And now I can't remember exactly it, so I'll just make a note to look back and see if that's something I can sort out in my mind, in my memory.
I would like to add on what Erin was stating. Where I live, not where I teach, currently we're in a very rural area where the elementary schools, they're pre-K-8 and they're spread out. There's some distance between them. And if you're limiting nurses to the number of students, and as Erin said, you've got some very sick children in each of those schools, it's almost impossible for one nurse to cover that kind of distance daily. So I would hope that we could try to fund something where we have a nurse per school. I know that may not be possible, but in some districts, that's absolutely the case.
And that's what I was going to say. In our district, we do have a nurse at every school. And so, of course, we are small, we're rural. And I can't imagine not having a nurse here. And we run about 190. We have about 190 students, 200 maybe on a good day. But we have a lot of students that do have disabilities or strong needs every day to have that nurse available. So for us here, I can definitely see where having her full-time is a huge benefit. I can't imagine not having her. So for these school systems that I hear you saying, they're having to share, I can't imagine that. So that's definitely something that I feel like we need to really look into and see what we can do to kind of help that.
I do have another question before we leave this topic of federal safety, state safety rules. Who is responsible actually for maintaining that buildings and facilities are ADA certified?
That's actually, I can't say that I'm knowledgeable about that. Jamie, do you have any insight to that for us?
No, that's a great question. And I don't think I've ever been asked that before. So that's a good one for us to find out. Let me shoot it up the chain right now, see if I can find us something.
All right, so as a quick summary for the must-haves, we talked about funding And maybe possibly weighting support for ELL students so that students who are requiring more support are able to access that. We talked about an increased need, especially for nurses, maybe moving away from just a straight ratio and also looking at other factors that would get more access to nursing. And we also talked about social workers in that same kind of capacity. Trying to think, is there anything I missed that in our must-haves? Jamie, well, I know Jamie's taking notes. Our wonderful Jamie. So let's start to think about maybe the should-have. So the resources that maybe they're not mandatory, like tied to federal dollars that have to be spent in that specific way, but they're essential to ensure the student or student group receives access to a quality education.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I have one more question.
Yeah.
Because in case it belongs in the must-have. So we've talked about we need more guidance counselors, we need more social workers. We danced around we might need more SROs.
Mm-hmm.
At which level here is it possible to talk about adding more positions for there to be teachers so that numbers are smaller in the classroom? Is that the conversation? Is that where this goes? Is that conversation here, or is that, because essentially that's the same thing, like a ratio situation, right?
That's a good question.
I mean, I mean, this is a problem that we all know. We need more teachers, especially now we're having a thing. I didn't know if that was like an imperative or understood that's going to automatically go on there, come one, come all, or is that something that we need to actually say?
I would like to explicitly state things. I don't want to leave anything unsaid or any lines for anyone to read between, especially because at the end, like I have to sign off on this. So I don't want to sign off on anything that is unsaid.
It also says state law, safety, and similar. And in my world, I find out that in the regular classroom, 35 or 25 is the cap. And then in my room, of course, it's free for all. It's a different thing. And that's okay. I love it. But who decides that? So the question is sort of similar to what Samantha's asking, like who decides that and how do we make sure? Because I found out that's not the same in other counties in some conversations. So I do whatever. I want to make sure we talk about that because we need more teachers. Probably more than we need those other things right now.
I was going to say.
So this is a really good point. And I think too, I know it's easy to like, it's a great question to ask, like, how is that done now? But then we're starting to look at current BEP. I think let's just talk about like, what would we like to see? So do you think our ratio, like, do we stick with the ratio formula or is there something different you guys think would work?
I think must have. That it's in the must-have category and it's change that ratio in the future, however possible.
I also think the
to a lower ratio
based on the kids because like this year, I've taught more than 25 kids 4 separate times in my classroom, and I teach 8-year-olds or 10-year-olds, so that's a lot of 10-year-olds. And right now, this is the hardest year I've ever had. I have 6 diagnosed cases of autism in my room. I have 10 diagnosed cases of ADHD. I have 6 kids who are special ed in reading. I think you have to have an acknowledgement that different groups of kids need different supports and different amount of people. So like, I think 27 is always too much, always. Sorry, my dog's gonna try to participate. But when you said that, I think that's what I've been trying to get across to like my district this year is that this group specifically, if you had looked at the needs of these kids ahead of time, the funding should have gone to getting them a 3rd teacher because that will impact them throughout, like when they get to middle school, when they get to high school, because right now they're not getting that, like, and even when they were in younger grades, they had a 3rd teacher in kindergarten, and then they've been just at ratio since then. And now we have a bunch of kids who just moved here from California, and so our numbers are higher. But considering the kid as well as like funding to go into how we put teachers, I guess, as well. So more teachers, but also like different. I've had a group of 25 that didn't have all of the needs that this group has. I think that's the issue with the ratio thing is different kids need different things.
So not like, it sounds like, I think as a group, so far what we've discussed, that the ratio model, we understand why it is the way it is, but that we would really like to consider looking more at, or maybe not necessarily more, but we want to consider also the needs of those students that are making up those groups. You know, if the model is changed to include more ELL, more nurses, more social workers, more guidance counselors, more special ed teachers, the people that support these students, you know, hopefully that does help clear our plates a little bit, but ultimately that child is still spending, you know, 5 of the 6 hours in your elementary classroom, or you're still responsible for them for that period you have with them. And that can still have a big impact. If they are struggling academically or socially, emotionally, it's still very hard to meet everyone's needs within the day, especially if your class size is large on top of that. So ratios, we think, need to be lowered. Is that correct? And we'd also like to consider that ratio continue to be adjusted based on student weights of the needs that are identified in the population. Does that make sense?
And Morgan, if I can just add, to what Kami is saying, as well as Elizabeth, possibly to ensure that in helping the classroom teacher that those needs are met, that also maybe there be an increase in funding for educational assistants to also go in and assist those teachers as well.
I agree. I absolutely agree.
And I was going to add the same thing in terms of special education teachers, paraprofessionals. I know they're so often underpaid, and as students' needs change, they might have an IEP meeting where they might have increased services in the general education class, but with the support of a paraprofessional. And often those needs can't be met in the middle of a school year because there aren't paraprofessionals to fill those positions.
That's another excellent point. And that's where we look at that funding piece, the static piece versus the something that like changes in the moment when something happens. That because I mean, ultimately, when you decide this is required for a student to be successful at school, I mean, once it goes in an IEP, we're legally required. So I don't know how we go. Like, I don't know how you go about that. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you can't fund it, I understand when the money's not there, the money's not there. But how do we make sure that we're meeting our obligations for these students? That's a great point. All right. Anything else, friends? We can just keep talking. We don't necessarily have to move on to should haves. We can just keep covering topics and just categorize as we go. Sorry, Hannah.
I would add to this conversation, and I know this is why this is such a challenging thing to dig through and to weed through, but how can we ensure that students' educations are equitable no matter where they are when we're looking at funding things that are happening on, you know, the school level and things like that, although they may happen differently in different places. Not for any good reason or bad reason, but people do things differently. So when we're looking at funding what's happening on the school level or the county level, how can we ensure that every student's access to education is equitable and across the field? So I would just add that. I guess that's not an answer, but to be mindful of that.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent point to always keep in mind. It's hard. These are big things we're talking about. These are, you know, huge needs that we know impact our students day in, day out, and us as well, you know, working in the job. Mr. Hicks, I think last time we met, you mentioned, I know we talked a lot about family needs and how diverse they've gotten, especially since the original BEP was put in place. Trying to think if there's any supports that maybe we haven't covered that would help with that. And I believe we covered pre-K, funding pre-K, making that maybe not necessarily mandatory, but universal, so that like in our district, you qualify for pre-K with socioeconomic factors or through a screening, like academic factors. I think it'd be great to have like universal pre-K.
I think it would be great too. I mean, moving forward, I can see that the need for starting kids, you know, sort of all on the same grade level. I mean, you guys have a hard time, okay? I mean, when you have a third of the class that is so far behind 2/3 of the class, you know, trying to get the third caught up, the 2/3 are suffering just as much is the problem here. Okay. I mean, you know, everything that you've talked about, you know, we talk a lot about helping the struggling kids, but I've learned through these conversations that the kids that really do great and the smart kids is what I call them, is they're suffering too, because it's hard for you to give those the attention that they need as well. So that, you know, everything that you've talked about is exactly what my concern has been. So pre-K just sort of helps get the kids that are struggling and the kids that you're talking about a better start.
I agree. Write that down. and because at the beginning, if we can diagnose learning issues and medical issues and all kinds of services that they may need that they don't even know exist at that age, then they are going to be better equipped in the classroom, no matter where they come from. So.
And I would even add, to make sure, you know, if that's just getting started and thinking about that, to make sure that the students and the places that need it the most really get those opportunities. We really need to think about, you know, who would benefit the most from this right away, you know, thinking about closing gaps. You know, we think about RTI, and I'd like for us to talk more about RTI, but, you know, I would love to see us not need RTI, you know, where we get to the point where, you know, we could just meet the needs of students, like Cammie was saying. And we think about those, you know, the academic needs and things like that. But like she was saying, you know, those sometimes even medical needs and things like that could be addressed a little bit earlier. And that's just the support that the kid's going to need so that they can be successful later on. So I totally agree. I'm very excited about the idea of pre-K. I think that would be a real game changer for a lot of students.
I was looking. Oh,
sorry. No, go ahead, Danielle. Go ahead.
I was just looking at what Elizabeth had posted in the chat about speech, and that had crossed my mind because I have a student that came to me that has not had speech, and I'm not sure how he has fallen through the cracks in this area, but I've gone to the speech teacher and talked to her, and she was telling me how overwhelmed they are within our county. And there's just not enough. They can't get it all their needs met because they're so overwhelmed, and they're kind of trying to, I don't mean this in an ugly way, but weed out some, trying to figure out who has the greatest need or who. So I agree with the whole concept of maybe even pushing the speech language as well.
Another word that someone mentioned was, I think it was Cammie. Cammie mentioned, you know, more pre-K means we'd have earlier access to students, and then maybe possibly being able to identify area of needs and even diagnose. Diagnosticians is something that crossed my mind as well. You know, I don't think that is necessarily something that's standard from district to district, and that really affects the timelines in terms of when a student can get tested and qualify for services. Something else.
I was going to add along those lines, like a school psychologist. We have one for our whole district, and she is always behind. So like it could take months before, you know, a student is actually screened.
Yeah, I can't even imagine trying to meet the needs of an entire district as a school psychologist. What else did I cross my mind? Shoot, there was something. It's gone. Anyone else?
Well, this may not be necessarily federal and state, and maybe some of you might have an answer, but currently in the district that I teach in and in the previous district, I think it was called, is it called CEP, CFP? It's where all students have access to free breakfast and lunch regardless of economic status. I know that is a grant process. Is that open for, is that limited, or is it open to all school systems and districts in Tennessee? Does anybody know?
I don't exactly know what it looks like outside of a pandemic because I know these answers and about this topic in pandemic times because it was a pandemic. So
I
I
know.
don't know.
In Cleveland City, we've had that for years, like pre-pandemic and on.
Okay.
So I don't know.
I want to
In
say,
Chester
is
County,
it,
like we did, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
in Chester County before the pandemic, yeah, we didn't, not all students received free or reduced lunches. And like in neighboring counties, all of their students received it. I was always kind of confused about that. Like some counties did, some counties did not. So
I feel like it may be a grant program, but I feel like it was based on the number of free and reduced that you have, the percentage of that, of your whole student body or something like that. And so, if you have a higher percentage, I don't know if it was a grant thing or not. Our school has had, or our system, has had free breakfast and lunch for our kids for, well, as long as I've worked for them. But then now the neighboring county does not. So, I'm not really sure if it's a grant or like that you can apply for if you get to that percentage of free and reduced, or if it automatically applies once you get to that percentage. I don't know.
Yeah.
And is that federal or is that state? Because I know that involves the USDA. But I don't know.
Oh.
Well, the reason I said, I think when Mr. Hicks was talking about helping community and providing community resources, because you do have extended family raising children and grandchildren or nephews and nieces, that is one resource that would definitely help the community as well.
I agree.
I think,
Go ahead.
go ahead. Well, I was just going to say that funding, because Kimmy brought up like state versus federal. I think part of the funding consideration would be to see like the ways that partnerships can be created with the federal government, because like one of the summer camps, when Read to Be Ready summer camp was a thing a few years ago, our district, like I partnered with ETHRA. And so every day that summer, anyone under 18 could come get, it's like East Tennessee Health something. They do a lot of stuff in the area, but we also have that federal grant, I believe, that's based on the amount of students below the poverty line. And I think that goes back to the ratio thing, because I'm so glad that every student in my school has the opportunity to get breakfast and lunch, and they have for 10 years now. But I also think that any child anywhere who needs breakfast should be able to eat before like school in the morning. So how do we find ways to not enable people maybe necessarily to not provide for their children at home if they're able, but it shouldn't matter if a child goes to school in Anderson County or in Farragut, Tennessee. If they're hungry, they should be able to get a breakfast in the morning. So how do we make sure that we use those resources? I don't know. Looking at federal and state funding complementing each other, I guess, should be part of the consideration. How can we use what the federal government gives us and then complement that with the state resources?
And I don't know if that's a must-have or a should-have, but if attendance for children is mandatory for parents, or they go to truancy court and go to jail, then feeding them might be on one of those lists, must-have or should-have. And I don't know if it's funny, I'm tiptoeing around because I'm not sure what's allowed to get put on our dreaming conversation that we're having. Like, is that okay to put? Because I sure would like to see that, because there are folks who need that no matter where they live.
Yeah,
the really nice gated communities and the projects all need that.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think you raise a good point. It's important not to assume anything about necessarily the neighborhood our students are in that needs change, especially in the last 2 years. We've seen some families that maybe you wouldn't expect to need help, need significant amounts of help, and maybe not necessarily knowing how to access that help as well either, because it's not necessarily a system that they're used to navigating. Kami, I don't think there's any rules about like cans and can'ts includes. Like it's okay to dream big, that you're, like Jamie reminds us that we are the experts here. We know the needs of our students and their families and our communities. I don't want to ignore something Elizabeth put in the chat, so I want to make sure we put this out into our conversation as well. The highly trained interventionists. I think that's a great point. I know it's done differently at the school level here and at districts, but how their RTI students qualifying for RTI are served, and who is serving them. I know in our district we use a lot of educational assistants to run our RTI groups, and they are wonderful and they work so hard, and our students are making gains. But I would love to see qualified teachers trained in delivering reading and math intervention, working with those students. I think that would have a really good impact on those students that, maybe especially those tier 2 students, those ones that are on that cusp of reaching those grade level expectations and maybe being able to leave the RTI model and return back to the general education part of that tier.
And I would kind of add, thinking about RTI, I think there's a lot of weight on teachers right now, and teachers are feeling a lot of difficulties that they might not have encountered in the past. But I think really thinking about those programs, and about the things that we're doing to make sure that students are successful, but when we're doing those programs, that we're really funding them well, we're supporting them well, so they don't kind of fall on teachers to make sure that they're floating along and that they're being successful. Because I think sometimes that's where some of the the weight can fall on teachers. So just thinking about those things and really supporting those programs well, so that students can be successful. That's what we want. And also teachers can feel like that there's a balance between things too.
Excellent point. I know we need to leave about 5 minutes for Jamie just to summarize what we did today, as well as just go over our last, our next meeting, just so we make sure we're all on board with when it's happening and where it's happening and what to do if you can't get in again. Is there any other thoughts that anyone has before we start wrapping up?
Okay. Well, without anything else, don't be afraid to interrupt me. If it hits you like a strike of lightning, you can stop me and I'll add it to it. But for the meantime, here's what I captured. I do have a couple of, I'm not so sure if these are all questions, so I just have questions/concerns. Really, I think they're just kind of thoughts to continue to guide the team as you discuss, but weighted funding and ratios based on student needs, school sizes, etc. That is something that definitely surfaced throughout the conversation. Is, do we need a little bit more information on that? How do we play with that? Even if we make a suggestion, can we at least have a caveat that it's based on ratios or it's based on student needs, etc. On the job training, surfaced a couple times as well, how important that really is. The other one is, how do we ensure we're meeting the unique needs of students if the funding is not there? So what is the safety net, so to speak, to make sure that we are meeting students' unique needs? How do we ensure every student has an equitable education? And how can we use what the federal government gives us and complement it with our state funds? So those were kind of the questions and concerns that came up. Anything else that I did not capture that you'd like me to add? Okay. Semantically, it sound right? Okay. All right. We can wordsmith together. All right, so here were some, I didn't actually get anything beyond the must-haves, and if you would like me to shimmy some of this down to a should, then just let me know, flag me. But must-haves at this point, school counselors and social workers, again, adjust ratios to support at the school level. That was the first thing I captured, although once ratios started surfacing more, I added it to the top. Special services, and under special services, I have ELL, ESL, interpreters, RTI, such as highly trained interventionists, programming, materials, diagnosticians, school psychs. Those are the ones that surfaced. Can you think of anything else that goes right under special services? Okay, on with the list, I have SROs, school nurses, teachers, which again, adjust teacher-student ratio. And a question is like, is there a reason it's different across the state? EAs or paraprofessionals, universal pre-K, feeding programs beyond what is already grant funded. Okay, what did I miss?
I don't know that we necessarily missed it, but I think just seeing Cami kind of triggered it for me. One other thing that we didn't cover that I think might be worth talking quickly about is funding for special areas teachers, the arts, things like that as well.
I think it's not even just the specialist teachers. I mean, you're getting rural districts who cannot find or fund, I guess the funding's there, but just trying to entice teachers in those hard to fill positions such as math, science, foreign languages, there's also a need as well.
I didn't even
Whenever
think
we
about
talk
that.
about teacher needs as well, funding is such a big part of that. Is like, I work in a rural district, and when you can get paid more to live closer to like I don't know. I think our ranking in the national, what we pay teachers, is part of the reason we're having a hard time keeping teachers in, especially like rural positions right now. So I don't know if that's something that's added on to a possible solution for the needing more teachers, but we had that problem this year. We were allowed to get a third teacher because our class size went above ratio, and it took us 4 months to find someone who would take the position. So we had the money, but we couldn't get someone there. So I think competitive pay is part of that as well.
Yeah. Well, I think just teacher retention is something that I think could definitely go under the should have. It's something that would make a big difference.
I think you can add CTE to that. Of course, I work in high school, so CTE is a big part. I mean, I'm in CTE, so obviously that doesn't necessarily apply to everybody, but I think that the competitive pay is a big thing for that, because finding these folks that specialize in these hands-on type of industries and then enticing them to come to work in education where they're not going to get paid as much. I think if you can increase that a little bit, then you're going to get some high quality educators to come in and teach these kids these skills that they need to know when they go out into the industry. So, I think, like some of the others were saying, I think that might help, recruitment and retention of high quality teachers, especially in those industry skilled areas like the CTE areas.
That's an excellent point. Excellent.
I want to go back to what Morgan was saying. Robust fine arts programs are directly related to social emotional learning and curriculum that's high in those areas that can help everything. Like it can help the guidance counseling stuff and the behavioral things and the things that the psychologists are working with. Like it's an synthesized topic, and kids need that as well. Some kids don't have music until they get to middle school or stuff like that, or art or things that are of abstract nature that are not specials, they're vitals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, more of those for sure, especially if that's what we have to do before we get the money to get all of the other things we want in terms of behavior specialists, psychologists, guidance counselors, and all that, because that's our bread and butter in the classroom right now. To recover from what's happening with their hearts right now with the pandemic. So,
yeah, I'll piggyback on what she just said, and a lot of what I've kind of thought about over the course of this whole conversation is like we have all of these needs for our students, but like I guess I'm thinking like from a prevention or a diagnostic standpoint, like why are all of the needs there in the first place? You know, and so is it because we've taken art out of elementary school and they don't get art or music until middle school? Like, could that be a small part of the problem on top of a lot of other things? I don't want to sound like, you know, that there's not any problems, but I guess I'm thinking from a prevention standpoint, like we're wanting all of these things to be put in place, but why? I don't know. I guess it's just a little bit heartbreaking that we all, I mean, we all know this, but they have so many needs that they haven't been there before. So we want to try to help them with those needs, but why is it happening? Like, and maybe that's not a school funding question. That's just me thinking out loud. But, you know, if we fix some other things, maybe some of those other needs as they get farther along, maybe won't be as prevalent. I don't know. That may be a discussion for another.
I know exactly what you're saying, because RTI, I have kids who, when I get them in the middle school, you want to know why they're not doing well, and it's because both of their related arts classes, they go to RTI math and RTI reading. Well, of course they're miserable. They haven't had a break from learning hard things all day long, or learning things that are already difficult for them. And so yeah, that's why the research shows that robust fine arts programs, you know, that's one of the ways to alleviate some of that's going on. So that would be something I would put in the must-haves. I'm not sure if that's okay, but fueling, I mean, we're doing that in Tennessee right now with a couple of grants, trying to fuel money for arts programs, because I think they could do something to help. So
I think too, that goes back to, I think it was Hannah who raised the point about equity, actually there's a couple different people raised that point about equity. You know, how do we make sure a child that moves from district to district is still getting a quality education? And I feel like that these vital arts, I think would fit under that, because it's different from district to district. Like at our school, my students get music, they get art, they get library, they get PE 2 times a week, and they see a guidance counselor 2 times. And, you know, it wasn't until we started having more conversations that I realized that that's not the norm. So I think it goes back to that equity and how we're funding teachers and teacher retention, because, you know, you may want an art teacher, but if you can't keep one or find one, then you're not meeting that need for equity.
Yeah,
so
and
I do want to be respectful of our time, but Cami, please go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I was going to amen what you said and point out, like, last week or last meeting, I was like, listening to Danielle talk about how they're sharing guidance counselors, but then she just blew my mind again, because in rural out there in Sharon, they're not messing around with sharing nurses, and we're sharing nurses. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, yeah, this is, we've uncovered a bunch of things. So, okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, and it takes us, I mean, on the slide that Jamie's got up right now, it does say that, you know, that just doesn't mean the district's going to spend that money in that specific way, just that they be funded to do so. So I think that might answer some of our question with the way it's currently done. That, you know, at the district level, there's choices that are made with the information that they have. You know, you do the best you can with what you know.
Well, and Danielle knows that that's probably because of rural hospitals all going out of business, right? Okay.
Yeah. Any other final thoughts before we wrap up and remind ourselves of when we meet again?
I did add strategies to recruit hard to fund positions, robust fine arts programs such as art, music, etc. And then I added down and should, so it kind of is in a little bit of both, so you all can decide later, since this is kind of an initial brainstorm, is teacher recruitment and retention strategies such as competitive pay. Right. So at least gets you going.
And maybe to save us time for next time, might also include teacher emotional supports for times like right now when we're burning out like a candle. Okay. Yeah. That's all.
Yeah. All right, Jamie. So we meet back again December 7th, 3:30 Central Time, 4:30 Eastern Time. Jamie has sent us all of the meetings already on the calendar. But please reach out to one of us if you don't have that information. I know I lose that in my in my email. So I pinned them all in Outlook because otherwise I'm like, when is it? Where is it? So please reach out if you're not sure when it is or where it is. Jamie, the categorizing and costing feedback, is there anything with more detail that you know to add to that?
Yeah, so as like what you're doing now is kind of getting out the initial kind of stages of your brainstorm, and then the next meeting what you do is really kind of firm these up. Like you're going to have the discussions of, does this really seem like a must or a should have, which are probably going to be the two categories that are going to be the most difficult to shake out anyway. But then once that's considered your categorizing activity, is to put them into those 4 buckets. Then those will become kind of formal recommendations. So one of the charges is to also think about the costing associated with each of those. Some teams have already articulated they do not feel comfortable attaching costing to it. There's somebody much more well equipped to do that than they are. However, this group may feel differently. So Morgan, you'll lead that conversation to see how folks feel about costing and whether or not that's something you want to take on as a committee or not. But really just shaking everything down into those 4 big buckets so that we can kind of have a product of formal recommendations to send up to the steering committee. That's it.
All right. Thank you again to Hannah for volunteering to be our vice chair. We really appreciate you taking that on. Thanks all of you as well for making yourselves available on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving and participating so actively. And like, this discussion was just awesome. You guys are great. So I hope you'll have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Be safe, relax, have fun.
Enjoy your macaroni and cheese.
Yeah.
Thank you.
See you all soon.
Take care.